Welcome to the second seminar in the Centre for Social Impact's public seminar series. This public seminar series gives us a chance to sort of have a deep dive into a topic we might not know much about, and that's certainly true for me today. So today we welcome Dr. David O'Shaughnessy. So he works with us at the Centre for Social Impact as a mixed method researcher. He's got so many different skills and his background is so diverse. And before he joined us at CSI, he was doing a PhD in a really interesting area, and you'll hear about that today. So he's looking at the biopsychosocial investigation of Indigenous psychoactive plants and their application in the treatment of addiction. So you might not know this, but Australia has formally recognised therapeutic potentials of at least 2 psychedelic substances. So this is relevant for us, the shifting context, and it's a great opportunity to go back to someone who really knows the area and has even travelled to Peru to find out more. So I'll hand over to you. David will probably speak for around 30 minutes. So we've got generous time after that for discussion and questions. And that includes people online. Feel free to either write questions in the chat, or we always prefer you to say the questions too. So I'll hand over to David.
Okay, thanks, Lizette. And thank you to everyone for coming along, both here in person and online. It's nice to see some people turn up for this topic. So yes, as Lizette mentioned, I'm an anthropologist and a researcher at Centre for Social Impact. And it's an interesting time to be talking about psychedelics. The rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin in Australia went into effect on just Saturday last. So this is very recent, but it's legally possible to use psychedelics for therapy in Australia as of a couple of days. So it's really a pretty amazing shift that's happened. I've been interested in this topic for about 20 years, and it's happened very, very quickly. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about how we got here and where I think all this might be going. I will touch on my PhD research as well. The whole thing, as Lizette mentioned, is a biopsychosocial investigation. There's a ton of different results and things I could talk about. I'll just focus on a little small portion of it, and I'll try and broaden the discussion out a little bit. And I will try and keep it relatively brief and just kind of high level, and leave some space for discussion and questions at the end. So, what's it? Share screen. Oh, yes, that would be a good idea. Sorry. Let's get that going. Okay. So yeah, it was about actually 10 years ago now. I didn't realise it was that long ago. Think about the dates. It was 10 years ago that I set off to Peru to do my fieldwork for my PhD in Terracotta. On the use of Indigenous plant medicines in treating addictions specifically. And this is a photo there from the centre where they do their ayahuasca sessions, which is a psychoactive plant brew that comes from South America. On the PhD, I will talk about it a bit more later, but I mean, for now, I can say that when I went there, what I was thinking about was I wanted to lead clinical trials, maybe not lead, but be involved in clinical trials and this kind of thing. But after leaving, I actually became much more interested in Indigenous perspectives on psychoactive plants, particularly around shamanism, which will inform a lot of the ideas in this talk, and I'll expand upon what I mean by that later on. So it's interesting that where I wanted to be is sort of happening now in society. So I'll talk about that. The general breakdown of this talk, I'm going to do it in 3 parts. So at the beginning, I'll talk about clinical psychedelics, what they are, how they work. Then I'll contrast that with some Indigenous approaches to doing these things. And then finally, kind of bring it together and talk about some of the social impacts that affect both of those topics. I'll do it in 3 parts. And to start off, the clinical psychedelics. So people have probably heard the term the psychedelic renaissance, and it's well and truly landed in Australia. You would have seen a lot of different movies and books around this. There's a glut of them. Most of this stuff comes out of North America. That's where the majority of the the movement is happening, I guess, and where most of the research has come from as well. Michael Pollan's book there, How to Change Your Mind, I'm sure someone in the audience has read it. That was kind of a big deal. Like, seems like everyone was reading that book when that came out, and really introduced a lot of people to the idea that psychedelics was something that could work in therapy, whereas previously there'd been this idea that they were extremely dangerous or harmful. So really, what was from my perspective, like a fringe or subversive culture for quite a long time, number of decades, has really gone mainstream. You had an article in the Lancet from quite a while ago, at least 15 years ago, saying that this stuff has gone mainstream. It's landed. And the book there, the DMT, the spirit molecule, that is over 20 years old, and this is the first sort of psychedelic research in humans that happened after the resumption of research. So in Australia, things have been changing actually pretty quickly, and it's been surprising. You could say that Australia is leading the way on this front. I think we might be the first to do this. In 2021, the government announced $15 million for psychedelic clinical trials. And then just this year, they have rescheduled MDMA and psilocybin for the purposes of very narrow treatments. So treatment-resistant PTSD or treatment-resistant depression. Only for those two conditions, and only for authorised psychiatrists who have been through some kind of ethical procedure. I don't know exactly how it works, but the point is that it's quite restrictive at this stage. It's not something that's just happening all over the place. So it's a slow change. And as I mentioned earlier, this has just happened literally a few days ago. So to kind of fill you in on how we ended up here with psychedelic therapy happening legally in Australia and even in Perth. I heard on ABC radio there's going to be a clinic somewhere. I don't know where exactly it's going to be, but there is one, or there will be one. How we ended up here, the standard story in the literature is something like these two waves of research. So the first wave that took place started in the 50s, although LSD was synthesized in the early 40s, I think, but it sort of caught on in the 50s and 60s. And there was quite a lot of research going on, actually. It was very promising, and they kind of morphed through different periods of how people thought about them. In the early days, they were called psychotomimetics. The idea was that they mimic psychosis. So psychiatrists themselves should take them to understand what it's like to have some kind of condition. Then later on, they realized these are actually quite useful in therapy. You can use this. I don't know how much people know about this history, but it's quite connected to the political movements of the time, anti-war movement, civil rights, and so on. You can think of Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out mantra, which really means like turn on to the message of the drug, tune into this thing and drop out of mainstream society. Stop facilitating structures that lead to war, to the time of the Vietnam War. So this all kind of spilled out of the university and ultimately ended in prohibition and a complete shutdown of research for, you're talking like 30 years. And really, the war on drugs comes out of this. It's really draconian, exaggerated, punitive measures for drug use. So that was the first wave. That ended sometimes toward the end of the 60s, and total shutdown of any research in humans. This came back again in the 90s with Rick Strassman, that book that I mentioned, the DMT, the spirit molecule. He was the first guy to do psychedelic research in humans after the ban had taken place. And what he did was injected people with DMT, so intravenous injections of DMT, which will cause like a total replacement of reality for a temporary period of time, maybe 20 minutes or something like that. The person will just go somewhere completely different. There's all these things in the book about people going to spaceships, and it's really quite diverse range of things that happen. But that from there kind of kept growing, and then clinical trials started, and it became much more rigorous, and the research methods had improved a lot since the 60s. So this kind of just kept increasing. And some of the early research, you wonder where the money came from. The military was actually, American military was funding PTSD research. They were interested in this, and there was a big a person, don't know who it is, had a huge amount of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin price had gone so high, and they just didn't know what to do with their money. They set up their own private funding body and just funded projects. And MDMA PTSD was one of those. I think it was called the Pineapple Project. Now, in the end, they lost all their Bitcoin. They got locked or something. So they ended up looking for donations themselves. But anyway, it's an interesting way that it all came about. And there was what's been happening is this consistent wave of impressive results in clinical trials. It just keeps coming out. And this is just, I'm not going to go through the whole history of this. There's not much need. It's good enough for the TGA. That's fine. But just to give a flavour of the kinds of things that were coming out, this is a trial of psilocybin, so the alkaloid that's in magic mushrooms, versus escitalopram, which is Lexapro. And they're showing on the graphs, time going forwards for the patient from the day of dosing onwards with both drugs. On the left-hand side, you're looking at changes in depression scores. So lower is better, is a good thing, and psilocybin is in the red. The Lexapro is in the blue. So they're comparable, at least as good for the psilocybin, maybe a little bit better in terms of dropping depression scores. On the right-hand side, you've got the well-being scores, and there you see quite a big increase for the advantage of the psilocybin, higher well-being, obviously being better. One caveat to this is that SSRIs take a little bit longer to actually start working, right? So a counter argument to this is, well, they're going to reach parity later on, which is fine. There's no problem, but psilocybin is obviously working a lot with therapy, by the way, is working a lot faster, and it's also not something you're taking regularly. So it has some advantages. But that's just to give a sense of the kind of evidence base that this thing has been building on. So that's the standard kind of story of how this has happened. I would argue that it's missing a pretty significant piece, which is that Western science and culture largely got its ideas about a lot of this stuff from Indigenous people in the first place. And psilocybin in particular is, from the Indigenous perspective, a story of extraction and bioprospecting. That's how it started. Maria Sabina on the left there was a Mexican healer. She worked with psilocybin mushrooms, and Gordon Wasson on the right was a guy interested in ethnopharmacology, and somehow he was there, and she agreed to tell him about the practices on the conditions of anonymity, which he later violated and published photos of it, which is they're all over the internet, and some other conditions. But anyway, he eventually wrote an article in 1957 in Life magazine talking about the mushrooms. Of course, it's huge social interest. And it was 2 years from that time that psilocybin was extracted, identified, and became an object of scientific research that we could work with. But the original idea was already out there, and we got it from Maria, funneled through Gordon Wasson. So the idea that psilocybin could be used in healing is without doubt not new knowledge at all. It was already being practiced. So this is a pretty significant part. And there's more to this story. Earlier than that, mescaline extracted from the cactus also came from observations of Indigenous use. But we are here now with sort of growing anticipation of regulatory change, or has already happened in Australia in a limited sense. And there's been this proliferation of psychedelic startups, investment, a lot of capital investment. So we have corporations now that are valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Most of this is happening in the US, but it's spreading out. And, sort of running away, there's been attempts at patenting psilocybin. Compass Pathways, I'm pretty sure, were involved in trying to effectively started trying to establish an artificial monopoly before the market opened up. But that's what they're accused of doing, and there were some documents that came out which kind of substantiate that. So the point of all this is what was impossible 15 years ago is now increasingly becoming reality and quite big money. So how do these things actually work? I don't want to get too heavy on the theory, but this will be important for later on when we go to the end and start talking about, well, what the impacts might be for society of using these things. So just some basic theories of how they work. At the beginning there, set and setting is the mainstream theory from the 1960s. The original way of thinking about this is still widely held and it's still basically accurate. What it says is that when you administer a psychedelic drug, the outcome will be dependent on these two things, the set and the setting. The set is basically you, the person taking it, their mindset, what they bring to the experience, and the setting is the context within which you do it. And the idea is that the drug is highly sensitive to these things. So you can imagine, taking psilocybin in an environment that feels unsafe, you're going to give a very different outcome to taking it in an environment that feels safe. So the context sensitivity is important. More recently, there's been these more neural-based theories. A default mode network is a big one. You can see it on the diagram. That's the kind of famous image. The default mode network is something like the neural patterns that are in existence when you're in introspection. So you're not doing any tasks, you're just like thinking about something. It's something like the neural correlates of your ego, right? But when you take that, and that's the left-hand diagram there. But when you take a psychedelic, classical psychedelics, you get this, the default mode network breaks down, you get this crosstalk between all the different parts of the brain, and this goes along with this well-known phenomenon of ego death, that you take it and you lose your sense of self and temporarily and so on. So it eventually comes back, but this is sort of explaining something that is going on in the brain. Sort of related to that is this Rebus model, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And this one I really want to come back to at the end of the talk, but the idea of this is kind of revolving around seeing the brain or the mind as a kind of prediction engine. So people, when they're younger, they're very open to exploration and examining everything. And as you get older and you learn about the world, you build these models, and you don't need to test everything anymore. You can just kind of go with what you know, and you get these ingrained patterns of seeing the world. Now, critical periods are an idea from psychology that tend to exist in children. They're like sort of periods where you can learn a lot. So there's critical periods for language, and if you miss these critical periods, it becomes hard to get back. Well, it turns out that with psychedelics, there's new research coming out. They can reopen critical periods in adults, which is a pretty big deal. So this is like re-enabling neuroplasticity, the kind that you might get in a younger person, but for an adult. And that's this idea of relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So this ability to restructure beliefs and worldviews with the assistance of psychedelics. You can see how that would apply to therapy, but could also be dangerous in the wrong context. And most of these theories, they're largely individualistic. They just usually look at the person, maybe the context that they're in, but they're through that lens. There was a researcher in '97, Betty Eisner, suggested actually the broader social context is also important. So she tried to tack onto the end setting, and matrix, where the matrix is the broader social, broader society, basically. This didn't really catch on. I hadn't read many people reading about it. I talked to a guy recently who had heard of it. It's the first person I met who had come across this idea. But I'll return to this because I think this is useful in context, together with the Rebus model. The last thing I say about these models, all of them as well, is that they tend to kind of look from the outside to try and put some objective structure on top of it, but they don't capture the inherent kind of weirdness of the actual experience of taking these things. Whereas if you look at the way that Indigenous people, and when I'm really referring to South America here, my area of knowledge, the explanations and theoretical systems tend to include what happens in the experience, and they incorporate that into some kind of cultural or logical framework. So that's a good segue to jump into talking about Indigenous approaches. And probably the first thing that's worth noting here, that would be an ayahuasca session. So that's happening in a small little cup. The first thing to note about this is the really deep historical roots of these plant-based drug practices. A few years back in Bolivia, in the Andes, this snuff set was uncovered. The thing on the left is the pouch. It's actually made out of fox snouts. I don't know if that was intentional, but and on the right-hand side is the snuff box. So, and inside this thing, they found traces of DMT, harmines to make ayahuasca, and a few other different alkaloids as well. But the point of that would be to snort it into the nose, and you get a quick movement into the brain. So that's at least 1,000 years old in Bolivia, and there are other archaeological finds and evidence to say that yes, these practices really are ancient. So the use of psychoactive plants is often associated with shamanism, at least in South America. Although shamanism is not really defined by the use of plants, but the key element really is this idea of a hidden world or something being revealed that the shaman can access, some sort of hidden information. Sometimes that's mediated by plants, but it doesn't have to be. And I think this is really where the kind of analogy between clinical psychedelics, the psychiatrist as a shaman, this kind of idea, it really breaks down, because very often Indigenous uses are not at all limited to medicine and healing. And there are many other examples. I mean, some include divination, so finding out information about something, where the animals are for hunting, for example, and also negative uses, including assault sorcery. This is a big kind of aspect of the South American shamanism world. And in the painting here actually depicts that happening. There's a shaman on the left-hand side with the bow and arrow. He's sending that eagle back to kind of interfere with these other people that are carrying a ceremony down the bottom. And he's standing up and defending himself by summoning these energies, all the patterns that you can see going across, plus the animals that he's called up. There's a tiger and different animals that he's, power animals that he's sort of combating the other shaman with. And I guess another example is even that healer standing up, by the way, is Shipibo healer. And in that tradition, it's actually very often the doctor that drinks the ayahuasca, not the patient. So there's a complete reverse of the clinical psychedelics model. And it's the doctor that is taking the ayahuasca to kind of reveal something about the patient. So often there's a distinction between illnesses that are natural and illnesses that are considered to be spiritual or in origin. And they want to work out what it is and how it should be treated. Just to say these ideas of non-medical use is contemporary things that are still going on. I just saw this recently about the children that were lost in Colombia. The Indigenous people and the government kind of joined forces to try and find these kids. There was an article where one of the elders, they were getting, they've been lost for a while, turned to drinking yahe, they call it, which is ayahuasca, for the purpose of finding the kids. And they drank it the first time, he said it didn't work. Drank it the second time, and then he said, yes, things were found today, and that turned out to be the case. They were found on that day. So just to make the point that these are contemporary, ongoing practices that are still happening. Although that said, medicine and healing is a big part of the landscape of psychoactive plant use. And one thing that I kind of want to point out is that there's a real richness of the landscape, particularly to do with health and illness. Not something that I can speak about from personal experience, but it's just from reading and seeing images like this. What you've got here is a painter, the guy in the middle with his chest cut open. He's the painter of this, and a few other ones that you'll see the style throughout the presentation. This is depicting his kind of entry into this world. He had a physical heart problem, and his father said, no, you need to go and drink ayahuasca, go to the session. This is his session that he's painted what happened to him. So in the ceremony, his vision was of this Western doctor coming, cutting his chest open, showing him where all the errors were, the problems in the heart were, sewing it back up together, and he says that sorted his physical problem out in real life. So it impressed him so much that he ended up becoming a healer himself. And went on and did that for quite some time. And then after he retired, he became a painter and painted the visionary world of what was going on. It's so complex. All these everything in there has some meaning in there, and they're all related. It's a sort of amazing world. So that also kind of gets to the point of this unseen world, of this visionary world, having some kind of connection to health. And I'll give you an example here to make it a little bit more concrete, because these experiences are not just happening with the plant, but they're mediated by a trained or experienced healer who's got various techniques at their disposal. There's quite a big focus on the body. The Western ideas tend to be focused on the mind a lot, but they're very into the body and these purging practices, the singing of songs that are considered to be healing, and also the use of tobacco is almost universal across South America for the purposes of energetic manipulation and warding off negative energies, basically. So a way to control energetic forces. And I'll just back up. You can see all that stuff. That's what we mean by these energetic forces. They're something that you can kind of control, manipulate. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. And this is from a book by a guy named Joe Tafur. We just lost the screen. Okay. There's a North American doctor who also trained in Peru, learning like curandeirismo, the traditional Amazonian medicine. So he's kind of on both sides of the table. And this particular account is about a guy who was a Vietnam veteran who had quite bad, severe PTSD, and never really been able to find relief from it, was on permanent psychiatric medication, and was sort of regular at therapy sessions. So he ended up in Peru, and I'll just give you his first experience. The guy's name is Russ. So it says, Russ was deep in his ayahuasca experience. He was looking into his body and saw dark black leeches bubbling up to the surface of his skin. They were rising up from out of his stomach and intestines. The ayahuasca was, as the Shipigos say, driving the darkness out of him. Curiously enough, Jared, another guy who was there, also saw these oozing creatures. He says this does happen in ayahuasca ceremonies. Sometimes multiple people share the same vision. He says, I quietly sat behind Ricardo, the curandero, the healer, not really sure what was happening. After a bit of observation, Ricardo opened up with a relentless machine gun style Igaro. Igaro is the magical song that seemed to dig deeper and deeper into Russ. Once he started chanting, Russ saw that the leeches went from oozing to flying out of his body. It was as if Ricardo was pulling deeper and darker leeches out of Russ's body, some with nails hanging off them. Blue sparks went flying. In the middle of all this, Russ is sitting up every now and then, vomiting intermittently. So the guy actually had amazing results from this. He stopped taking psychiatric medication. He did still go to therapy and was sort of still a regular at that. So he's still working. It's not like some magical everything's fixed, but he did have this sort of breakthrough kind of moment. And I just want to compare that with a couple of other quotes here that have the same theme, which is moving something out of the patient's body in this other way. So the middle one here says, this is actually not from South America. This is from APY land, Nunkari healer in Australia. It's a healer talking about how their grandfather did healing. So he took out whatever it was from the sick person's body. He took it outside. He carried it all the way, all the time, thinking about the person's spiritual well-being and their spirit. And in the book that I was reading about the Nunkari healers, there are a lot of parallels between the way, not that they're using the same plants or anything like that, but the way of working is very, very similar. Now, one more connection to this, the bottom one there, I felt so much lighter, like something had been released. It was an emotional purging. The weight and anxiety and depression had been lifted. And there's this like something is leaving the body. But that last one is actually from a psilocybin clinical trial account. So it seems fairly clear that these kind of substances can induce these releases, or however they're functioning. This is something that can happen, although something to consider is that perhaps having a knowledgeable practitioner can either accelerate or facilitate this process. And there are the two books that I was mentioning, the Nunkari Healing on the left-hand side, and the Fellowship of the River, which is really a bunch of ayahuasca case studies from Peru. Super interesting and well worth a read. And there are these sort of parallels in the way you're removing sickness from the body, the use of the breath, and also dealing with this like world of entities, basically. Okay. Another big difference from the Western approach comes down to how people are trained. So how these practitioners actually learn to do these things. And it's really completely unexpected if you've not encountered this. But in the Amazonian traditions, they literally learn medicine from plants by participating in what's called a dieta or a diet. And what this is a lengthy isolation in the jungle, so the person can spend, and there's this thing of the longer your diet is, the more you're going to learn from it. So very limited food intake, all these different behavioural taboos, and then regular ingestion of the plant that they want to learn. Now, sometimes they're quite sophisticated. Sometimes these plants can be like obviously psychoactive, other times they're not. And I think the way you prepare the body sensitizes you to something and it has its effect. So in the diet, the kind of the waking world and the dream world tend to blur together a little bit. And there's a guy was talking about this. He did a little bit, and he was talking to his teacher. And he said, "Oh, I'm starting to lose track of like whether I'm dreaming or awake." He said, "That's good. You're starting to get it." So they want that to happen, right? And then the plants will, if the person is considered to be somebody who can heal, the plants will like manifest themselves and impart knowledge. So one of the important points about this is a relational practice, as in relational to plants, to nature. I mean, the plants are seen as sentient. Certain plants are seen as more sentient than others in the systems. But the plants themselves want things. They want certain regulations to be followed, and they want some kind of there are responsibilities that come along with it. And this is a very different relationship, very different social relationship to something that's just purely bought and sold on a marketplace, say like a synthesized psychedelic. Not to say that it can't be healing, but the relationship is very different. And the quote that I don't have on here is from a paper that I published with a colleague a couple of years ago from a Peruvian healer talking about how he was brought into this world. He says, "In my diets, I also learned rituals." So the rituals are coming out of the diets. They're not like learned from other people. They're coming out of the diet. And to sing as well. I have an ikaro from that diet. So his song, and there are other examples where the plant would come out and sing the song to them, and okay, now you can use this song. They've given me quite a lot of knowledge about rituals. An enormous ritual with like teachers from all around the world, and tremendous octopuses, giant sea octopuses were there. The ritual took place in a huge malocca, the hut, and they took me to that ritual in order for me to learn which ones were good and which ones were bad. So it's like, knowledge about this world, who are the entities that you should work with and shouldn't work with, and skills are being imparted for the healer out of this process. Okay. So the last point that I want to make on the Indigenous side of plant medicine is there's been a parallel world of research that's been going on for as long as the clinical side. But it's largely observational, not so much based on clinical trials because it's in place with the people, with Indigenous people working. So a different form of knowledge. And I'll just give an example from some of my own research, looking at the addiction treatment stuff. So in this particular centre, I've got a couple of pictures there. The people on the left are examples of the patients. And then on the right, the healer who's preparing this purge, which patients on the left have probably just had, not looking too happy about it. But in the centre, they would stay for around 9 months, and they're regularly taking these purging plants, having ayahuasca sessions, and doing dietas. So I'll just give you very quickly some results. And this is super similar to the psilocybin plots that I put up earlier. They're time, going from left to right. So when you start the program on the left, and then number of months going forwards. On the left-hand side, we're looking at positive things, and the reason I selected those things, they tend to be not present when someone has an addiction or they're diminished. So emotional health, spirituality, and physical health tend to be lower when people have a serious addiction. And you can see throughout the program that the prediction is that they'll increase on all those facets. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have negative things that tend to be present when someone has a serious addiction, symptoms of mental illness, craving, usually for a drug, but it could be something else, and stress as well. And you can see this nice tracking down of all the different elements. So this is not the same level of evidence as a clinical trial because it's observational. You don't have a control group. You didn't control all the variables and stuff, and that's a big difference in the two research worlds. The last one I'll show you is just one item from a health questionnaire, and the question is basically, how do you feel about your health now compared to how it was a year ago? And they can say, well, it was better, it's about the same, or it's worse. At the beginning of treatment, if you ask people this question, you get a 50-50 split. Most people are the same or worse, and around half are already better. But if you keep asking that question during treatment, effectively everyone moves over to the better side. So people are at least feeling better throughout the treatment. And that's quite a broad range of plants that are employed in that and techniques in that particular therapy. So far, I guess what I've tried to outline is that these Indigenous traditions are quite sophisticated, and they're related in some ways to clinical psychedelics, but they're much broader in their scope and diversity of tradition as well. And I sort of want to make the point that these are not pre-scientific methods, but they're wholly separate body of living empirical knowledge that have relevance to practice. So in terms of where I think the psychedelic renaissance is going, I'll kind of take it back to the beginning here. I'll look at a couple of things. First, the medical applications, and then as they apply to clinical psychedelics and Indigenous, and then finally some social impacts more broadly. So on the clinical side, I think what we're going to see, and we have seen, is some incredible stories of healing. That's why they've been rescheduled, because it's kind of hard to ignore. The body of evidence is really quite large now. One example you may have seen on 60 Minutes, this guy in the top left there, is a policeman who was one of the first on the scene at the Port Arthur massacre, the Port Arthur Cafe, and it was quite moving listening to him describe. He walked in there and saw the bodies and just kind of started shutting down. It was really too much, and so he had serious PTSD that kind of wouldn't leave him for some time. But he eventually found healing in an MDMA trial in San Francisco. It's quite a big thing for a policeman who probably would have been ingrained that like MDMA is ecstasy, like you can't do that. But he ended up going and doing this therapy session and really had a big breakthrough experience. Now, to counteract the flip side of that I also want to point to is in some kind of psychedelic experience, there's a factor of like increased vulnerability. You're more suggestible, you're in a completely altered state of mind. So there's the issue of abuse. And we've already seen examples of this happening. The guys on the bottom right, Symposia, they're like an independent media organisation that cover a lot of these aspects. I think they do it really well. We've even seen examples of some of these stories on Four Corners, I think it was recently, happened in one of the MAPS clinical trials. So it's just sort of this double-edged aspect of it, and I think both of those things are going to have to be managed in some manner. On the Indigenous side, with the plants, I think there's a growing disparity that I see between a recognition of the clinical psychedelics that is, has all the power of clinical trials behind it and now corporate money, and then there's the Indigenous plant-based approaches. And there's this disparity between the recognition of them. And I don't think that disparity is based in any actual empiricism. It's just that all the research happens on one side. It's more a function of funding structures being geared towards medicine as business, basically. So the system is pushed towards treatments that make money on a mass scale and also can be proven through clinical trial efficacy. And clinical trial efficacy tends to standardize out Indigenous practitioners and methods, and also sort of biases the research towards an extractive process. If you want to do a clinical trial with ayahuasca, let's say, they will want to see it standardized and extracted, and that is a different practice. This is turning into something else. Some company could patent it or whatever may happen, but it's hard to make it work as it currently exists. So one thing I would like to see is increasing research focus on ways that foster and really privilege Indigenous perspectives without forcing this extractive process. So you can avoid doing that, which modifies the relationship between the practitioner and the plant. And if we want to have culturally appropriate medicines in this area, it may be that fostering cross-cultural Indigenous communication and knowledge sharing may be the only way to actually achieve this. But there would have to be a bottom-up thing. It can't come from the top down. So again, I see two things happening here. One is a sort of potential exclusion where the clinical world kind of takes over. But there's also a potential for sort of this revalorization of Indigenous medicines that's actually based in empiricism. But for that, we do need to allow anthropology is handy there because we can allow for different worldviews. We can work with different ways of understanding things. It doesn't have to all be the one thing. The last point that I wanted to make is kind of broadening things out significantly and thinking about what the broader social effects might be of psychedelics and this inherent political potential in them, and how we can maybe guide it towards positive outcomes. So this, in a similar way to the Matrix idea of the setting, Matrix was the broader society, didn't get that much attention. Research about the political potential and broader social effects of psychedelics really doesn't get, it's fairly limited compared to the clinical medical research that's been going on. And I think there's been a sort of tacit assumption that psychedelics, by their nature, foster pro-social beliefs, nature connectedness, pacifism, anti-war sentiments, all this kind of thing. And it's probably a holdover from the hippie era, and it's like overt links to LSD and other psychedelics. Unfortunately, there's emerging evidence from the US that doesn't really conform to this view. There's a growing sort of vein of research that is showing the links between psychedelics in the US and the far right. And you might remember the guy on the left from the attempted overturning of the democratic elections in the United States back in 2021, January 6th. And it's sort of self-styled shaman. So it's a participant basically in an anti-democratic fascist movement. And also an advocate of psilocybin mushrooms, by the way, in order, in his own words, to aid in correcting criminal mentality. So pretty far cry from the hippie movement. Now, I'm not trying to say that every single person here is promoting psilocybin and making a link in that sense. Actually, what I'm trying to draw attention to here is the way that beliefs are formed in current society, because things have changed significantly. And movements like that one, and anti-vax as well, and others like it, they're largely sustained by communities who sort of converge on increasingly persuasive misinformation, conspiracy theories, and the sort of shared political beliefs that are informed by those theories. Now, the problem is, in a networked world that we have now, so many people develop their worldviews through digital sources, and there are two things that happen there. One is information can be weaponized, it is, and AI will only accelerate this process. And also, the conspiracy theories can provide a way for people to kind of make sense of a confusing or even downtrodden kind of existence. So there's a temptation, or they give people an explanation for the world. Now, if we remember the Rebus model, the relaxed beliefs model, in a context of sort of steady misinformation, depending on where people are getting the information from, psychedelics in that context can actually be quite dangerous. Shifting worldviews in ways that to the person feel right, but based on whatever information sources they happen to be connected to, which may or may not be based in reality. This is a difficult problem to get at, but I think the answer is kind of simple. I don't think the answer to this kind of social risk of psychedelics lies in the substances themselves, or in prohibition or some kind of narrow attempt to control or regulate. I think the point really is that it's the social, Eisner's matrix, that primes the information network, which then interacts with psychedelics. So it depends what's there already. And a key factor that we can think about is inequality. There's a lot of evidence that unequal societies and grossly unequal societies lead to negative outcomes. So things like breakdown in trust in institutions, stress, addictions, health problems. There's a lot of evidence for this. And back in 2009, Wilkinson and Pickett were compiling evidence just looking at the effects of income equality, or inequality like a noxious social element. So in concrete terms, what I'm saying is if the society has relatively equal access to things like housing security, healthy food, good education, a connected community, healthcare, employment or some means of living, institutions, therefore, that you feel you can trust and are oriented towards people and communities, not towards corporations at the expense of communities, then you're going to have a very different context within which psychedelics will be around. Those things, that lack of inequality will act like a social hygiene effect, kind of decreasing the need in the first place for people to turn to conspiracy theories, misinformation, and kind of priming the matrix for these more positive outcomes, and relaxing beliefs and what information are we taking on. And I think housing psychedelics in corporations or within structures that are contributing to inequality is not going to solve any problems. So what I'm suggesting here is that we should think of society more broadly as equally important to the setting. Psychedelics are super sensitive to the context. They're probably equally sensitive to the society that you're introducing them to. And I think high levels of inequality will create pressures that contribute to effectively poisoning the information substrate that people are building their models of the world on. And this is more and more important as information is abstracted away from everyday life through computers. And it's the interaction of psychedelics with that broader context that I think is the issue. So to wrap this up and open up to questions, I think rather than seeing psychedelics as apolitical medicines, which is one line, it's just medicine, nothing else, which I don't see how can be true if they really do have the capacity to influence belief structures, or as something to bring about political change that we want, because we may not like the sort of change that we see. A recent paper called Psychedelics Politically Pluripotent. They could go in many directions. It depends. I instead see them as a call for us to kind of set the stage well, set things up well, so we get good outcomes in the first place. And I find this a little bit harder to think about with the clinically regulated psychedelics. It's sort of something like disembodied chemicals, like owned by a large corporation, some sort of transactional relationship. To me, it's more intuitive to take a view that comes from Indigenous perspectives, where the plant medicines are living things. These are things you're interacting with. There's a direct connection and a relational aspect there, where if you create a social well-being as the base, you can almost think of it like doing something for the plants rather than what can the plants do for us. We're setting it correctly for the plants in the first place. And I think this opens up to ideas of Aboriginal ideas of caring for life, plants, land, and people. So connecting that kind of thinking would make this a broader project, which could be about medicine, but it's also community healing, spiritual connection, and knowledge sharing is something as well. And I'm thinking about Pat Dudgeon's psychology of Indigenous flourishing, which kind of moves beyond individualism and anthropocentrism as well. So bringing all that together. So to me, making space for Indigenous approaches and possible intercultural exchange, as well as is an important thing, and not allowing that kind of knowledge to be dominated by the logic of the state and the market, or reduced down to these narrowly defined clinical categories, because I think they can offer so much more than just that. But I'll leave it at that, and thank you for listening. I think we can open it up to questions if we have any.
I'll need the applause just to get our thoughts together with that. Thank you so much, David. That was you covered that in so much depth and with such knowledge and richness.